Multi-hazards, all about protecting communities.
Hi everyone, this is Multi-Hazards. Here we are again, the podcast where we take a deep dive into issues in emergency management, climate change adaptation, security, etc. And ultimately, it's about protection. Protecting communities. That means you. I'm your host, Vin Nelson. Welcome! Today has been such a privilege. I've had the opportunity to have an in-depth conversation with Dr. John Clague. So please allow me to read you his biography. Dr. John Clague is Emeritus Professor at Simon Fraser University. By the way, that's where I did my bachelor. Burnaby in the province of British Columbia in Canada. He was educated at Occidental College for his bachelor, the University of California Berkeley for his master's, and the University of British Columbia for his PhD. Dr. Clague worked as a research scientist with the Geological Survey of Canada from 1975 until 1998. In 1998, he accepted a faculty position in the Department of Earth Sciences at Simon Fraser University. Dr. Clague is a Quaternary geologist with research specializations in glacial geology, geomorphology, natural hazards, and climate change. He is former director of the Center for Natural Hazard Research at Simon Fraser University. Dr. Clague is a fellow of the Royal Society of Canada, former president of the Geological Association of Canada, and past president of the International Union for Quaternary Research and the Association of Professional Engineers and Geoscientists of British Columbia, APEG, BC. He's recipient of the Geological Society of America Burwell Award, the Royal Society of Canada Bancroft Award, APEG BC's Innovation Editorial Board Award, the Geological Association of Canada's GAC ERW Neal Medal, GAC's Logan Medal and Ambrose Medal, and Geoscientist Canada 2019 Professional Geoscientist Award. He received an honorary PhD from the University of Waterloo in 2017 and was inducted into the Order of Canada in 2020. Dr. Clague is a leading authority in natural hazards and risk, and in quaternary and environmental earth sciences. A major focus of his research over the 50-year period since he published his first paper on large slumps in the Monterey Formation in Point Reyes National Seashore in California is natural hazards, with emphasis on landslides. Dr. Clague is noted for local, national, and international research collaboration with other geologists, engineers, geographers, biologists, and physicists. He and his students have conducted research on landslides, earthquakes, tsunamis, and floods in Canada, the USA, Bolivia, Argentina, Chile, Austria, Italy, and New Zealand. Now that was such a rich background. So before we get into this interview, I feel it is important to say a territorial acknowledgement of the First Nations who possess this land where I live and where I'm making this podcast. So I'm borrowing the text from a local post-secondary school's website from Kwantlen Polytechnic University, or KPU. So here we go. We work, study, and live in a region south of the Fraser River, which overlaps with the unceded traditional and ancestral lands of the Kwantlen, Musqueam, Katzie, Semiahmoo, Tsawwassen, Kikite, and Quiquetlam peoples. These are the names of various First Nations groups around me here in Greater Vancouver, here on the west coast of Canada. Now, without further ado, let's get to the interview. Dr. Clague. John Clague is here. He's an expert in geohazards, and he's from my home city of Vancouver, British Columbia, Canada. And we're here today talking in a Skype call. So welcome, Dr. Clague. How are you today?
Thank you, Vin. I'm fine, thank you. In self-isolation here in Vancouver.
Okay. All right. So you've been surviving this pandemic. It's already been a couple months.
Oh, yeah. Yeah. I'm retired, so that makes it a little easier. We don't have children in the house, which makes it easier. I kind of have empathy for people who are trying to hold down jobs and also taking care of their kids and also teaching their kids when they're not teachers.
Yeah, people doing homeschooling and things are starting to open up, but there's no such thing as 100% opening. It's kind of like a little bit here, a little bit there. So, yeah. And I was reading a lot about you online. I checked out a few videos, and you have been in the game for decades on geohazards. And before we even start, I was wondering, there's the word geohazards. That's your expertise. But what is the geo there? Is it geology or geography?
It's both. Geo is just a shortened moniker for geoscience. And in the professional realm, we include physical geography, geology, geophysics, even atmospheric sciences and ocean sciences is under that little new moniker. Really means the Earth. You could say that they're Earth hazards, but geohazards has a nice ring to it.
Okay, it sounds great too. So our listeners, if people had listened to my first episode, this podcast is called Multi-Hazards, and I got the name from some scholarly work that was done in King's College, UK, from Dr. Gill and Dr. Malamud. They wrote an article about multi-hazards. It has two meanings. One could be multiple, but the second meaning is that it's kind of like the domino effect, or they would say cascading. That means some hazards can kind of bump into another hazard either simultaneously or consecutively, and then a third hazard might come in. So it gets really messy, really complicated, but people on the ground, we have to deal with it because hazards don't just kind of wait and say, are you ready for the next one? They just come. So I know you've dealt with that over your career. And for example, landslides, you wrote a book on landslides, did you not?
Yes, I did. You can think of it as hazards don't happen in isolation. And we have long understood that you can't silo something like an earthquake into a single hazard because earthquakes can cause other emerging hazards. A classic example would be a tsunami. We've had tremendous loss of life in this century from destructive tsunamis that have been triggered largely by very large earthquakes. I'm thinking of the earthquake in Japan some years ago, and even earlier back in 2004, we had that catastrophe in the Indian Ocean. That large tsunami that killed almost 250,000 people was triggered by a very large earthquake. And we've long understood that hazards are linked to one another. I can give you another example. It would be a severe rainstorm. Well, rain is a common trigger for landslides. So we know on the West Coast where I live that really torrential heavy rains are going to be followed by landslides. And we've got to make that link of the possibility of having flooding and landslides in rapid succession.
Right. And for our international listeners, just to let you know, West Coast, yeah, that could be anywhere in the world. But in the Canadian American context, North America, West Coast is basically the West Coast that's on the Pacific Ocean of Canada. So just going back a little bit here. So we're talking about geohazards, we're talking about landslides. And one thing is that there was arguments happening on Twitter and social media. There's even some people that they call themselves this on Twitter. They say there is no such thing as natural hazards. Now, I know that Simon Fraser University in Burnaby, British Columbia, that's where I graduated from a long time ago. You were there for years. You have what's called, you started it too. I saw it today in a video. It's the Center for what?
Natural hazard research.
Okay, so these people argue, they say there's no such thing as natural hazards because if an earthquake or a landslide or a flood happens like way out in, as Canadians say, the boonies or the sticks, it just happens way out there. No people are affected. Maybe some animals are affected, but we don't really even, it doesn't go on our radar screen unless there's people living nearby. And then we're like, oh, it's an earthquake. So I can understand that argument, but it's kind of like erasing a lot of vocabulary that we use on a daily basis, and I guess you used in your career. So, anyways, I was just mentioning that.
Well, I'm a scientist. I'm a physical scientist, and having said that, I have learned that one has to, again, not silo oneself when talking about hazards and risk, and embrace the social scientists, the humanities. But hazard is actually, it is a difficult term. And natural is an even more difficult term because very few hazards are today in the world in which we live are really natural. And we can talk further about that. But they are underpinned by natural earth processes. And that's where the science comes in, the physical science. I mean, you have earth forces, internal earth forces that are responsible for large earthquakes and volcanic eruptions, the secondary effects such as tsunamis. You have atmospheric effects, which are natural, arguably, although we're beginning to question that due to climate change, but that produce cyclonic storms, hurricanes, typhoons, floods, you name it, tornadoes. Those are all natural processes. But you're right that it only becomes a hazard when people or their property are impacted. And then you slide over from that thought into the arena of risk. And risk is something that's embedded in the social sciences. It is what happens when a natural hazard impacts people. How are they at risk? Are they vulnerable? Are they, what kind of magnitude of impact might a severe storm have? If it's a small city or a town, it might be limited. If it's a very large city, today we're seeing the impact of a typhoon in Mumbai, in India.
Right.
Then you can have much larger risk. And risk is important. That's why I have kind of drifted over into the social sciences, because you can't talk about hazards without talking about their impacts on people.
Right. And I guess if we're standing back at the end of the day, there's no such thing as people just researching the earth processes and the atmosphere as it is, and sort of looking at it from an artistic or appreciative point of view. It's all related to how it affects humans, because we're the one doing the studying and we're the one who wants to know how much risk is coming to us. So
I would say then that we do need studies of the natural processes, and a lot of scientists do just that, and they're reluctant to stray too far from the science. But we do need to understand these natural phenomena better than we do. But for me, it's not satisfying to totally focus on just the hazard. I'm interested in the risk. I'm interested in having an impact in what I do in terms of reducing that risk. What can we do to deal with these natural phenomena so that we can never completely eliminate, but we can minimize the impacts they have on people.
Right, exactly. And I mean, somebody has to sort of be in the middle doing that between the hard science, as we call it, and how it affects humans. Somebody has to make that link, because what is science for in the first place, right?
Well, you have to have governments, you have to have emergency managers, decision makers who are that arguably middle woman or middle man, to be non-sexist, who actually accomplish that objective. And they have to be somewhat familiar with the science, or they have to talk to people like me who are scientists to try and bridge kind of what's a natural wall between, non-geoscientists and decision makers and politicians. And we've had success with that. We got a long ways to go. I find it challenging, but also rewarding. Like I deal a lot on the west coast of Canada with the earthquake hazard that we have here. And, over the years, and I've been doing this for 40 years, over the years, and I'm not taking total credit for this by any means, but scientific of earthquakes has led governments to put a lot of public monies into basically improving our hard infrastructure so that when an earthquake happens, which in my view is inevitable, it's not going to be tomorrow probably, it's not going to be maybe 50 years from now, but it will happen. When that does happen, we can minimize the impacts on people. We're reducing the risk by spending public monies to improve our engineered infrastructure.
Right. And when communities or developers, I could say, they're deciding where to build, for example, and then they get the blessing of the municipality or whoever, and they put in some residential, commercial, industrial areas. They also do environmental studies, I'm sure. They have to get those to prove that it's okay. But there's been a lot of development happening in risky places, like on floodplains and on the sides of mountains. And could you comment on this?
Sure. Well, I've lived in Vancouver for 40 years, and I've seen the city quadruple in size from under 500,000 people to 2 million people. And a consequence of that is that the city is spread out, and we have put a larger number of people, way more infrastructure on our floodplains. And they call them floodplains for a very good reason, is because they flood. So we are in effect elevating the risk because the consequences of, say, a very unusual flood on the Fraser River would be disastrous. It would have huge economic consequences at the very least. And likewise, we're spreading our city and smaller urban centers in British Columbia, where I live. We're spreading them into areas that are very vulnerable to wildfire. So we are increasing the risk due to the increasing number of people who live in this province. Now it's getting close to 5 million people. And that's just one example. This operates on a global scale. I tend to worry about events that have often been called black swan events. They're totally unexpected. They're unusual. They catch people totally off guard because they haven't thought that they could happen here, wherever here is. And I think that we need to think about those collectively as a society, not to get paranoid about them, but to at least think about what would happen if we had, say, a magnitude 9 earthquake on our coast. It's a bit of a black swan event, a rare event, but a conceivable event that science tells us might happen.
Right, exactly. Now, I know before we had this interview, we were talking about possible topics, and we brought up the issue of overpopulation. And I know that's a kind of a risky topic, but I was comparing in my mind British Columbia, where we live in Canada, with California. And California, for example, they've got I can't remember off the top of my head, but they've got millions and millions and millions of people there in an area that's probably comparable to British Columbia. And I heard that, for example, people have been moving out of San Francisco, the Bay Area, Los Angeles. They've been going into these mountain areas where there are few firefighters, there's little infrastructure. And then these nasty wildfires that pushed by wind, sweeping through valleys, they come and just wipe out all these communities. But the high cost of living in urban centers is kind of causing people to just kind of spread everywhere. So you could say, we usually look to say Bangladesh or say India or China or some other areas for overpopulation, but there's overpopulation happening in some areas of North America, and California is, I think, one example. So I'm just wondering if you could talk about that. It's just that a lot of people moving into smaller areas and then also spreading themselves out all over mountain areas.
Well, definitely, again, you're right. I mean, we think that kind of Asia, Africa are the centers of population growth. Well, one of the fastest growing countries in terms of population is actually the United States. 330 million people. It's the third largest country in the world in terms of population. And what we've seen in the United States is people flocking to areas that are more desirable places to live. And among them is, for example, the smaller communities in California where you can maybe still afford a house, or the rich folks, they kind of flock to the coasts and live on hurricane-prone coastlines, again, jacking up the risk. But another big factor that's operating, not quite so much in North America, but in most other places in the world, are the emergence of megacities. And megacities, you can define them in any way you like, but typically they're cities with more than 10 million people. And what we're finding is that big cities, megacities, very rapidly growing cities, many of them are located in very hazardous areas. And I'll just give you a couple of examples. Tokyo. You may not be aware of it, but there are more people living in the Tokyo metropolitan area that live in Canada.
Wow.
And this is earthquake central. They know it, and they're doing a lot to try and harden their infrastructure for the inevitable next earthquake. But you might consider that's a huge population at risk. And a second example would be an emerging country, really, is Turkey. Istanbul is a megacity. It's got 15 million people in it, and it lies adjacent to one of the most active faults in the world called the Anatolia Fault. And if I had to identify a city that is going to have a catastrophe, it would be Istanbul, because that fault sometime in the future is going to slip and produce a magnitude 7 or 8 earthquake, and Istanbul is nowhere near ready to deal with that event. So all this to say is, with the increase in population, we're finding that more and more people are living in hazardous areas, whether they be areas that are vulnerable to earthquakes, or near volcanoes that are active, or along shorelines in subtropical and tropical areas where you have typhoons and hurricanes. Not a good recipe. You know, as scientists, we are gradually contributing to the reduction of risk by better understanding the hazard and doing some of the things I've talked about to improve infrastructure. But we're in a way that's being offset by the increased exposure of people to these events. And that's a consequence of population growth. Right. I know it's a touchy subject. I call it an elephant in a corner, but in reality, it is the main driver of the increased risk that we face from natural hazards, as well as non-natural hazards like epidemics.
Right. Now, I know you want to get into COVID-19. Maybe could we just wait for just a few moments? Now, just backing up a bit, I studied before that one reason we have such a huge population worldwide is because of, say, post-World War II, there was the Green Revolution, where scientists actually, they developed a lot of fertilizers and other technology and chemicals to actually increase crop yield. So worldwide, now I haven't studied this in detail, but there was a boom of population after World War II, and the Green Revolution played a part. And then fast forward to the 70s, there was a report done by Club of Rome where they were saying, look, we've got an overpopulation problem. And then some people were saying, well, hey, you white people in Europe or North America, you're just trying to be against the rest of the world. You're not going to let us develop like you have. So there was a big debate about social Darwinism and saying, okay, they call it lifeboat ethics, who should survive and who shouldn't. And it became a big thing. But at the end of the day, a lot of land masses worldwide had too many people. And you could also say some places actually had too few people because the countryside people started emptying out the last 20, 30 years and moving to megacities that are more at risk. So I wonder if you can dive into that a bit.
Yeah, that's a big, complicated subject. I have a very strong opinion about this, and it would maybe not be one that everyone shares. But having been around the block, since 1946 when I was born, I have seen the world become increasingly crowded. When I was born, there were fewer than 2 billion people on the planet. I'm still living to tell you this. And now we have close to 8 billion, 7.8 billion. That's quadrupled the number of people on this planet. And, without getting into a discussion about the haves and the have-nots, which really underpins a lot of this debate, there are too many people on this planet to support the ecosystems, the supporting framework that we have to accommodate people on this planet is being broken down because there are too many people. The well-to-do, North Americans, myself included, have a lot of responsibility for this because we live a lifestyle that is exacerbating that problem. China has kind of emerged from being a have-not into a have country, 1.3 billion people. The planet cannot sustain even the number of people that are on it now, in my opinion.
Right.
And going to face an increasing problem because as we move forward, population is not decreasing. Just as an example, I checked this out before I talk. Since the beginning of the year, there have been 60 million live births on this planet. 60 million. That's almost twice the population of Canada since the beginning of 2020. I mean, growth is limited. I don't care what people say. You ultimately come up against a hard barrier. Maybe Malthus was wrong back in 1800. Maybe Paul Ehrlich, I remember in 1968, I was very much influenced by his book called The Population Bomb. He made some predictions that did not play out. But ultimately, there's a hard wall. We live on a finite planet with finite resources. I don't know when we're going to come up against that wall. But I think that, the kind of what we're seeing is the prelude to that. We're seeing these global viruses that have emerged in this century and last century. We're seeing the loss of species on a record scale. Geoscientists view this as being kind of the fifth, catastrophe in terms of loss of life on the planet. I can imagine, I hate to sound very pessimistic, but I can imagine by mid-century that we won't have too many large land mammals in places like Asia or Africa or the United States. Those are all telling signs that we are in trouble. And it's interesting that we are preoccupied with the pandemic as we should be. Hopefully we get more preoccupied with the disparities in wealth in the world. But, sitting in the background is this issue of sustainability and the loss of ecosystem functions on this planet.
Right. I remember perhaps, was it 4 or 5 years ago, David Suzuki, who was he's still alive. He's a scientist and he was a TV presenter for so many years. He stated that even Canada can't handle too many more people. So that's one extreme. And then there's a think tank, it's out of Ottawa, I believe, and they're calling on Canada to bring in, 50 million more people and populate the north. And I was thinking, you've got these two extremes, but then I took a course from Yukon University about the north and what climate change is doing up there. And I'm thinking, the ice is melting. You can't even maybe travel 50 kilometers without falling into some into the ground because there's like cracks and the permafrost is melting and and the food security up in the north is getting really dodgy, as the British say. And I'm thinking, all right, we have two extremes. We have David Suzuki saying we've maxed out this huge country of Canada with 37 million, and the other side is saying we need to have more immigrants and build the economy in Canada. So, anyways, it's a big discussion there about how much is too much.
Yeah, well, I think usually when you have two quite in-member positions, that something in the middle is appropriate. I hear both sides. Certainly in terms of food production, Canada cannot sustain, population the size of the U.S. We are a big country. We're the second largest country on the planet. But as you point out, in the north, which is much of the country, underlain by permafrost, you're not going to grow very much, really.
Even with climate change, even with, it heats up a bit, but we're not going to be having booming farms up there.
No, I mean, a lot of it's just hard, bare rock, and particularly in the eastern Arctic, and you don't grow crops on soil deficient rock. So that's not the solution. And anyway, I think we ought to be an open country. I hate to see what's happening south of us. I think we ought to be a country that does welcome people from other parts of the world. We do that right now. We have about 250,000 to 300,000 immigrants a year. We accept a lot of people, and that's been good for this country. Immigrants have elevated this country. They've strengthened it. I hope we can retain that attitude in this country, and we have to fight hard against racism because looking south of the border, we might think that we're lily white. Well, in some ways we are lily white. We kind of don't fully embrace other peoples. We've got our own racist issues. I hate to say it, but we're a heck of a lot better off than many other countries in the world are in terms of embracing people from other parts of the world. But yeah, I mean, as I said at the beginning, even if we took 60 million people into Canada this year, we'd just be taking the people who were born since the beginning of the year. It's not the solution. We've got to somehow, without, focusing on a country or a continent, try to begin to reduce the impact that are people having on this planet. Otherwise, we're all going to be in trouble. There's no such thing as a lifeboat. It'll be a leaky lifeboat, and we'll all go down.
Right, exactly. And I know in Canada, First Nations people, for example, they're one of the groups that in the U.S., they're maybe African Americans. They also have Native Americans. But in Canada, we have larger growing population of First Nations, and they're often in these places. They're, of course, a lot in the cities, but also spread out in a lot of areas that are affected by climate change. So when people start mentioning we're going to bring in millions more people in the next decade or two, I think sometimes, especially when their consciousness is closer to nature and what the rhythms of nature, they're saying, really? You're going to be bringing in all these people? Anyways.
That would be, if I were a First Nations person, I would be worried about that as well. They've got their own issues, and I think there has been a shift. I think there's been a positive turn. We've got a long ways to go, but I just ask everyone to be open, open to the problems that people who are less fortunate have. In my view, and this comes across as a little weird from a physical scientist, but sort of inequities globally, regionally, and locally, disparities in the advantages that people have in income and employment. These are what drives a lot of these problems. It's a big underpinning issue. And somehow we've got to be more humanist, collectively and individually. And I kind of, sometimes I feel frustrated because what can I do as an individual? Well, you can do a lot, I think, in terms of trying to reduce these inequities. We're in Canada, not quite as bad off as in many parts of the world, but what struck me, I just heard that Jeff Bezos, who is the CEO of Amazon, is getting close to being the world's first trillionaire. And I think that is sick. It turns out that only a handful of Americans, a very small number of Americans, hold more wealth than the majority of Americans. That is sick, and that's only gotten worse with time. So
right. Sorry.
That's got to be rectified, or we're going to be continuing along the path that we have since the start of the Industrial Revolution, and we'll all be in trouble.
Right. I heard on YouTube, there was a man saying that it's kind of like, you have 500 people in a big auditorium, and then they bring in all the pies and the good food, delicious food, steaming carts of food. And then you have like 3 people in the corner and you give it all to them. And the rest of the people is kind of like, okay, you can have a few of the table scraps, but these 3 people are going to have it all. And you're thinking about, how do we say his name? Jeff Bezos? But you're thinking of, like, he needs a place to live. He needs food. He needs a place to go exercise. He needs work. But like, what are you going to do with all this money? Like, it's like you're looking at your computer screen and say, wow, I'm worth $1 trillion today. But even practically speaking, you can't do anything with that money, except pay other people to invest it. It just seems weird that somebody could be so rich.
It's more than weird. It's a symptom of a very bad economic system.
Right.
And I don't fault all billionaires. Bill and Melinda Gates have contributed to solving many, contributed towards helping with health problems internationally. So, but, the system rewards a handful of people and disadvantages everybody else. And I'm not going to get into capitalism, but we do need to somehow distribute wealth more equitably.
Right. And I mean, we may not go down the road of say capitalism or economics, but we can say that how we earn money, how we spend money, and who we give the power to earn and spend money is just, especially the last few years, it's not working. I remember growing up in the 70s and 80s, and a millionaire, we point to that corner on the street and say, that family, that's a millionaire. We'd be going, ooh, a millionaire. And now a millionaire, especially in Greater Vancouver, Canada, is like, millionaire, who cares? It's a billionaire that really counts. And it's like, oh my goodness, like, how many millions do you need? Anyways.
And on the local scale, I don't know how many of your listeners are Metro Vancouver folks, but, we live cheek and jowl against one of the poorest the poorest areas in the country, which is the East End, the East End of Vancouver. And people tend to shun that area, a bunch of losers. Well, they're not losers. It's a community of people, and they don't have the advantages that the millionaires, or for that matter, I have. I'm not a millionaire. But, I do think that's an underpinning message that we need to find a way to kind of narrow the gap between the rich and the poor rather than broaden it, as we've seen happening in recent years. And the countries that come closest to doing that are typically the Nordic countries. They're capitalists, you go to Sweden or Norway and you'll find a capitalist economy, but as a society, they try to reduce this gap between the haves and the have-nots. So it's possible even within the economic system we have. Some people would say, no, you can't, because capitalism is based on unlimited growth. And as we were discussing earlier, unlimited growth forever is just not going to happen. We're going to come up against walls.
And especially, for example, climate change is probably our biggest environmental bomb right now. And climate change is going to be taking away resources over time. So you've got growing populations, and then you have reduced food supplies and et cetera. So the way we take the money that we do have and spend it is very important.
Oh, yeah, no doubt. And it's kind of interesting to me that before the pandemic, climate change was on everybody's radar screen and we're going to do something about it. And now it's not there at all. I mean, it will return, and it is a huge problem. But we're so preoccupied with the pandemic that it's kind of been lost in the jet stream or the backwash of the crisis we're dealing with now.
Right, exactly. And I remember you were talking about in our conversations before about the Spanish flu of 1918-19. And of course, that's kind of, I think that would be in my Norwegian grandfather and grandmother's generation that they never told me about it. So then now we have this 2020 COVID-19 pandemic. So yeah, what are the main differences between the two? I think you looked into that.
Yeah, well, the Spanish flu is the same kind of ilk as the COVID-19. It's a flu virus, and it arose late during World War I think in 1918. At a time when the population on the planet was a tiny fraction of what it is now. I think it was about 1.5, maybe 2 billion people. And we didn't have a healthcare system at that time that could cope with this pandemic. And it very rapidly spread around the world, partly due to the fact soldiers were on the move. There were North Americans who turned out were infected or carriers of this virus or were in conflict on the European front. It very rapidly spread around the world as fast as COVID-19 has spread, but without a healthcare system to do anything about it. So the hospitals were unable to cope with the problem. People just were not given any support. And so it turned out it was it had a different impact on people. It kind of didn't have this demographic of being more fatal for older people. In fact, the Spanish flu killed as many children and healthy adults as it did elderly people. So it was different in that respect. It also, because of these very issues of the lack of health care, was way more fatal. So we had, say, 2 billion people on the planet. Well, 50 million people died in that. And that's close to 3% of the population on the planet was killed by that virus. We will not see that, I don't think, with COVID-19. We've learned some lessons into how to deal with a virus like this, but we've made a lot of mistakes as well.
Right.
So we're in a better position to cope with it. I think a big difference is you look at the economy in the world at the end of World War I, and you look at the economy today, how interlinked it is, how much larger it is. It has brought the global economy to its knees, and the economic impacts of this virus are just huge, immense. I mean, it's the impact on human life is absolutely catastrophic too. But our global economy is basically collapsed, at least temporarily. Large numbers of people in every country in the world are out of work, which has its own impacts on health and welfare.
Right. Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Especially the last 20, 30 years, the economy I remember we had Stephen Harper as the Prime Minister of Canada that was like almost for 9 years, but he was like jetting around the world trying to sign trade agreements between Canada and other regions. So, and he wasn't an isolated case. There were a lot of trade agreements signed and a lot of more trade. People used to joke, right, that you'd go to the store and your shirt is from Bangladesh and your mouse on your computer is from China and your just everything you own is from somewhere else. And then you're like, I'm a proud, patriotic Canadian. And it's like, well, everything you have, everything you are is from somewhere else. But the world is just absolutely globalized. And then we get this pandemic. People were jumping on jet planes and going here and there and everywhere, and it's just so easy to spread.
Yeah, we're fortunate. We are really fortunate that this isn't a super killer bug, that would like an Ebola virus, because then it would be a totally different story. Most people do recover. The economy is severely impacted. It's going to drag on, so it's not clear how the economy is going to emerge from this in the short term. And it does foster a belief that we should be looking out after ourselves, our own countries, and globalization is dead. I worry a little bit about that, because globalization does help people in poorer countries with having a job, for example. And I also worry even more about the loss of international institutions that promote global welfare. The UN was established after World War II for a very good reason. The world was basically in crisis at that point. And we see now that individual countries are pulling back from joining these and contributing to these worthy international institutions like the World Health Organization. And I think that's dangerous, because it does lead to more of a lifeboat kind of mentality. Worry about yourself, don't worry about anybody else. And basically that is not a good thing to emerge from this crisis, if that's what happens.
Right. And with COVID-19, really nations have had to work together, because we have airplanes connecting the nations. We have airports, we have train tracks, we have vehicles, we have boats, we have everything connecting each other, and we're so interconnected. And there was actually a professor in Simon Fraser University, where you've been working, named Jeff Mann, and he with another, and I forget the other person's name, but there was a book called Climate Leviathan, and they argued that in the future with climate change, we're going to need more international cooperation, and we're going to need the government to step in more, because, for example, in Canada here, there's some people that's like, oh, we're taxed too much. It's just, oh, the big bad government, they're just stifling my freedom. But on the other hand, when a flood hits or something else hits, it's like, who do you ask for money? Oh, my insurance company's not paying me. Can you please give me money? Provincial government or Canadian government? It seems a little bit hypocritical, but government and just the whole public, the community as a group, will need to step up. We need to step up in COVID-19, and we'll need to step up as climate change brings all kinds of strange things and extreme weather events.
Yeah, both of them. The current epidemic really has shown it brought into everybody's view the kind of disparities in society. And I agree that for that and climate change, we have to act as a global community, hard as it may be. And institutions such as the UN, they're deserving of some criticism, but we need to strengthen those institutions. We don't want to weaken them, because no country, no matter how powerful, is going to solve these problems on its own. And one thing I really do find positive is the medical community, in terms of trying to develop treatments and a vaccine for this virus, have been very open. This is something that science is not particularly well known for, as open communication, but there is this kind of more global scientific effort to kind of find some, vaccine or at least treatment for this virus. And I applaud that. And I think that's one positive thing in kind of maybe the discussion that we're having that is worth emphasizing.
Right, exactly. Now, do you think COVID-19, that it is actually maybe helped our preparedness, response, and recovery from disasters? That, like, this is it's like an exercise or a drill or a test. It's a big pandemic. It's one of those things that's on the radar screen of emergency managers, and what we have done and learned from this can apply to other disasters in terms of preparedness, response, and recovery.
Well, yes, and I think emergency managers are very good at trying to visualize scenarios of the unexpected. That's very hard to do. I've talked about these black swan events that are hard to kind of entertain as even possible. But when we have the possibility, for example, of having an earthquake where we live in Metro Vancouver during this pandemic, what are the consequences of one, disaster stacked on another? I can imagine that a really serious earthquake might result in large numbers of people having to leave their apartment towers or their homes. And in the past, we thought about, well, it's emergency methods. Where are we going to house them? Where are we going to put them? That's a big problem. But when you're trying to maybe congregate 100,000 people in some sort of facility, then you come up against this COVID issue. And, we need to think about the kind of black swan disaster stacking up on top of this current disaster that we're facing. And so I tend to worry about worst case scenarios. And in a way, I'm kind of the realist there, but I think I'm pleasantly surprised when one of them doesn't happen.
Exactly. But in a sense, we do need professionals. We need people to imagine, just like the John Lennon song, Imagine. We need people to get their minds working on different kinds of scenarios so that when it does happen, we can say, all right, so-and-so wrote about this 5 years ago, and maybe it was nonfiction, maybe it was fiction, but their mind went to explored that territory already, and they came up with a few solutions. Maybe we should look at that.
Well, I do think that coming back to the current pandemic, that we've learned a lot of lessons, and that we will be better prepared if there's a second wave or another pandemic. In Canada, it's disgraceful that most of the loss of life have been in senior care facilities. That's, in hindsight, that was not a black swan. You could see that coming, the way they operate. We would be, it would be disgraceful to allow that to happen again. So another positive outcome of this is that we're going to totally change the way we take care of seniors in this country. That's my firm belief. And we should have done it before, but at least we've learned a lesson in that regard.
Right. I really hope so. I was talking with my family and saying, like I'm 52, but you think about people as they get older and they need to dump a lot of their life savings into a few years at the end of their life into a long-term care home. And nowadays people are going to be like, I'm not dumping my life savings into something and then a disease comes and just like, boom, one day I'm gone. There's going to be a lot of fear and trepidation before people sign the contract to go into a long-term care home. So it's just, I really hope the system, it changes.
Well, yeah, and again, there's disparities. Part of the problem was that we, haven't adequately, as a society, supported those facilities with public money. Some of them are privately run for profit. They were understaffed. You had healthcare workers working in 3 or 4 facilities just to earn a decent living, and that all contributed to this problem. Compounded with the fact that you've got people that are seniors, they're more vulnerable. That's the most vulnerable in demographic in terms of age. Again, I think you could have seen this coming, and governments could have said, oh my gosh, I didn't realize how bad the situation was. Okay, you've been warned once, don't let it happen again.
Exactly.
I think that all these facilities ought to be run by governments with proper inspections, and maybe that will give people the trust. We need them. Basically, there's some people who can't look after their own after themselves when they reach a certain age. But we also should be respectful of seniors too. Many other cultures are way more respectful of their seniors than we are, and I will point out Indigenous communities way more respectful of their elders than European North Americans.
Right, exactly. Now, how do you see this pandemic playing out long term? We've talked about some of the things, but what kind of permanent impacts do you see?
Wow, that's a tough one. I don't really want to go there because I don't know. I don't think anybody knows. I think one thing you can say is there's going to be huge changes, but it's hard to know exactly what those changes are going to be. I would say again that I think we're going to totally transform senior healthcare in Canada, but it's hard to know. I think this could linger. This virus could linger. It's interesting, going back to the 1918-1990 flu epidemic, it did disappear. That particular virus was not present, as far as I understand, on the planet after about 1920. So we can maybe hope that this one will disappear as well. The other possibility is it lingers, or the gene sequence modifies and turns into something else. I think we're, hopeful that we're putting a lot of hope in the vaccine, and I don't think we should necessarily bank the house on a vaccine. It may or may not arrive. Maybe, we've never developed a vaccine for HIV. We've developed treatments, so we've diminished that problem, but we haven't really eradicated the virus. So, I know I'm kind of going all over the board here. I don't think anybody can really predict what the world's going to be like when we get through to the other side.
Well, let's do a thought experiment. What if you were the boss, you were the prime minister, and you had the power, and you took all the lessons from COVID-19, and then you applied it to your own field of geohazards? Like, what could change there?
Well, I think it depends upon what geography you're talking about. In Canada, I think we have to better educate people. I'm an educator at heart, as to the nature of the natural hazards and the full range of hazards that we face. That's hard to do because disastrous events are rare, so they're not really fully on people's radar screens. But nonetheless, I think we have to make perhaps a better effort with maybe more resources to provide factual information on hazards. I kind of walk through the Metro Vancouver area and I look at some places I wouldn't live because they're at risk of landslides. They could be flooded. People who live in those homes don't appreciate that there is any risk. So partly it is an educational exercise. Encourage governments to spend public resources in reducing risk. And as I said, I applaud the British Columbia government in particular for making those investments in terms of, earthquake mitigation. Our bridges, critical facilities have been seismically retrofitted. So we have done something. It's not like we haven't done anything, but I think we need to apply that on a more national scale. I think the federal government should play a larger role than it does, rather than in this country, we tend to delegate responsibility to the provinces. Well, the provinces don't have the full resources to deal with these problems. So I would like to see, if I were the prime minister, I would try and develop a more kind of strong federal response to the issues of natural hazards, particularly climate change. That's a bee in my bonnet right now because, and I know the current government is worried about that and has limited flexibility in dealing with the problem because of different provincial kind of opinions about that as an issue. But I don't think you can say, well, it's somebody else's problem. It's the Chinese got to do something before we do it. We have an ethical responsibility to deal with that problem before it becomes a disaster. And fortunately, with climate change, we do have time to talk it through and decide as Canadians how we want to tackle the problem. It's difficult because there are resource-based jurisdictions that don't really want to deal with the problem because their jobs depend on the traditional resource extraction industries. But, I still say it's possible. Communication is big. Talk. It's always good to talk rather than
Right.
not talk.
Now, scientists are basically one part of this whole process. And scientists like you will have a big role in all these things as they play out. So, well, let's start wrapping up the interview before we both lose our voices. Actually, there's a couple quick questions I like to ask most of the people who are guests on multi-hazards. And one is that, for example, if you were in a room, I guess everybody's still social distancing, but with people who are could be a Zoom or Blue Jeans or Microsoft Teams meeting, but you had people who were young and they were saying, okay, I've got university ahead of me, I got training ahead of me, and then some people are middle-aged, they were like, I want to change my career. So do you have any, say, career advice for people who are thinking about your field?
Well, I would say, geoscience is a strange field. It's very, very broad. It's like it's got tentacles in so many different areas of professional life. There are geoscientists who work for the mineral industry or work for petroleum companies, and then there are geoscientists who work on environmental problems, or geoscientists who work on the history of the Earth. I like it for that reason. It's very broad, and I'm a generalist. I try to look at things, step back and see the forest for the trees. So for me, it's a great field. But for any young person, I'd say find your passion. What is it that you really, really love doing? And don't worry so much about what it is. Hopefully, it does have some economic imperative that's going to pay off for you. But without passion, life's short. You want to be passionate about what you do. And so find what it is you really want to do, what you love doing, what you're passionate about, and then work hard to achieve your goals. I think nothing, comes for free. Nothing's handed to you on a platter. You've got to work hard to achieve your goals. Right, but it's a lot easier if you have a passion that you're pursuing. Maybe you want to become a professional musician, and that's your passion. You love music. Well, work hard to achieve that. My brother got a master's degree in music, and he wanted to be a musician. He couldn't find it. It just wasn't going to work for him, but his passion is music. So he teaches music now in a senior secondary school and loves it and is very good at it. The students love him. So,
that's great. That's great.
Kind of your journey in life takes you to strange places, but kind of pursue your passions, if I had to put it.
That's awesome. That's awesome. So what is one last thing that you would like to leave with our listeners, Dr. Clague?
I think everybody, we see all this distracting negativity around us. Well, maybe focus on the positive, focus on family and friends in these difficult times. Try to be good to others, to love others, and not be totally distracted by all the negativity that's going on around us. And I think many Canadians are doing that. They really are coming up with some creative ways of being part of the solution rather than part of the problem, and from all walks of life. So you've got to try to help others who are maybe less fortunate than you, and try to maintain some positivity and love other people.
Great. Well, thank you so much, Dr. Clague, for coming in. I really appreciate it, and I learned so much from you. I really, really appreciate it. I'm sure the listeners have too. So you have a wonderful week. Thank you so much.
Okay. Thank you.
So, how'd you like that? Great interview. I really enjoyed that. Extremely informative. Thanks again to Dr. John Clague for being a guest here at the Multi-Hazards podcast. Here's a little disclaimer that I add to the end of each and every episode nowadays, and it is, this podcast is meant to be educational and does not try to offer legal, medical, or other specific advice unless otherwise noted. Also, the opinions expressed here by me, the host, or by the guests do not necessarily reflect those of the organizations we belong to. So, here at the conclusion of this episode, I'd like to say thanks to all of you, every single one of you, for listening. Stay safe out there and stay tuned for more. This is Vin Nelson wishing you the best on your journey of surviving and thriving with all that life throws at you. Cheers to you all. Peace out.